Hi, I'm Mistress Giliana Attewatyr, and I am the current Kingdom Minister of Arts and Sciences for the Kingdom of Artemisia. And today I'm going to be sharing a overview of our new arts and sciences judging forms. So how to judge with these in arts and sciences competitions. So this presentation, it's going to give a walkthrough on how to use the new forms for judging in a competition. We are going to focus on the object form, which is a form for judging literally anything that you might be able to hold in your hand, as opposed to, for instance, a performance or a research paper. We'll mention those forms at the end, but you'll notice that those two items don't apply well to these questions, and we did create specific forms for those. We'll be using an example piece to give comments on. We'll be saying this throughout, but the key focus here is when in doubt, be kind. And don't be afraid to ask questions at the competition, beforehand, any of those things. Questions are good. We're happy to help. Before we get into how to judge in an arts and sciences competition, it's important to ask ourselves, why is someone entering something into a competition? There is obviously the option of maybe winning the competition, and there's some kudos going along with that, but many artisans don't enter just for that. Art is typically something that someone has spent a lot of time on. Maybe they've struggled with it, maybe they're learning. So many artisans are looking for feedback and for next steps. What went right here? What could I do better next time? And we're going to have some slides on how to best give feedback towards the end. They might be looking for ways to get involved. Maybe they're new to our society, but hey, I did some weaving in high school, so I'll enter in this thing. And so this could be very easily a way to hook or push away a new person. And they may be looking for kudos. They may be looking for just, how did I do this thing well? And so how to make sure that we give them some positive feedback to go along with whatever the judging results are. Not all artisans are like this, but many artisans can be very insecure. Very few of us feel extremely secure about our art. So while we do not want to coddle our artists, we want them all to leap forward to higher bounds. We're going to talk about, like I mentioned, feedback for all levels of artisans. Folks who really want the harsh input, and folks who are so afraid and may break based on what they hear. Once again, the key here is to be kind. When you're faced with a choice between being, harsh but realistic, maybe take a step back and be just a little bit kinder. Which brings us to why all of these new forms. We did not have a large turnout previously for our arts and sciences competitions, and we did reach out to our artisans to figure out why. Why are they participating? Why might they participate? Why haven't they participated in the past? And the key response we got back was less subjectivity. How can we make this more objective? What this means is that instead of one question that simply says, how authentic is something from 1 to 10, which is a very difficult question to answer as a judge, and frankly difficult to understand the answer as a participant, we broke it down into more questions with more discrete answers. Some of the questions may seem less important than others, but note that the point value should reflect that. So some questions have a higher or lower point value based on how much weight they should have in the competition. So for those who aren't especially familiar with SCA competitions in general, we typically have 5 major areas we look at, and then an area for judges' observations. That's the truly subjective portion of it. So we'll just work through these and just kind of talk about what these tend to mean before we dive down into the questions. The first one is authenticity. So this area is going to look at overall authenticity of the entry, but also use of materials and tools. There's a note here, it is not required to go to massive efforts to make things from scratch or to obtain super period materials outside what would be reasonable. If I was cooking bread, it would be reasonable for me to work the dough by hand, but it would not be a reasonable stipulation that I would go grow the wheat, for instance. That would be a different entry. So it helps to set what is the reasonable expectation. So for authenticity, efforts to achieve a completely authentic item, unless it is unsafe, will score best. Judge on appropriateness, cultural consistency, and period effect. This is balanced with creativity in materials and methods. When authenticity is not available, was a creative substitute used to give a period effect? We'll be talking about this as we go along. The next one is difficulty. Difficulty meaning how many steps were required, how much time, how much skill, how many different skills. There's a lot of different ways to look at difficulty. The goal here is to rate the difficulty of the attempt without considering the achieved result. Maybe the attempt was simple and it was magnificent, or maybe the attempt was very complex, but maybe the mark was missed a little bit. We're only looking at the attempt here, not how well the person did. So compare the efforts to similar efforts in the same category. How complex could this category be? Difficulty comes in many forms, and projects do not all have the same types of difficulty, and it's not reasonable. Some projects may have many different skills needed, but can be completed in a short amount of time, and some of them may have the same skill needed that has to be repeated 8,000 times. Those are two different types of difficulty, but take them into account. Note, efforts to complete preparation or background steps, such as weaving the fabric that you mean to sew or creating a tool, can add to difficulty. That certainly took extra time, but shouldn't be considered as what is normal for that category. If I am doing an illumination, it is not normal that I first create the vellum, but if I did create the vellum, well, that's pretty cool. That probably added to the difficulty. Workmanship. Now, here what we're doing is judging how well the artisan actually achieved their goal. If the goal was simple or complex, that doesn't affect workmanship. If they did a simple thing, they would maybe get a lower score in difficulty, but they could still get a perfect score in workmanship, and vice versa. So the goal here is to rate the workmanship of the project without weight to the difficulty or excessive weight to the authenticity. Really, the item we're looking for here in workmanship is how good does it look and function. We already judged whether or not the materials were truly appropriate authenticity-wise in a different section. Display. It's a hotly contested area that we've chosen to keep in, but you'll note if you look at the scores that there's only a very few points that are being associated with display. The goal here is to rate how effective the display is and whether or not it helps the viewer see the item and give any context with it. So once again, some folks love this one, some folks don't like this one. I've been on both sides of the fence. I chose to keep it in, but less than the amount of points that that are under that. Documentation. This is an important area that also has slightly less points than typical. It's also one of the areas that artisans tend to struggle with the most because typically speaking, the documentation isn't their strong suit. The goal in this category is to rate how well the entrant provided the information necessary to support the entry. This category score should not be significantly affected by grammar, spelling, or specific styles and formats as long as the required information is present and accessible. A spelling error here or there, as long as you understood what they were saying, we're not judging this one, shouldn't be a huge decrease in score. There is a place for it. And then the last one is judges' observations. Completely subjective. whatever it is that you'd like to say there. And don't forget the feedback, the comments, which we'll be talking about next. So each section also has a new item, which is bonus questions. Bonus questions is let the judge note when an entrant has truly gone above and beyond in each different area. This is where, okay, well, they did make their scratch from scratch, or this is the best documentation I've ever read, or wow, this, like, the complexity of this, the difficulty was through the roof. It's not a reasonable bar to hold normal entries to, but there's the ability to add a couple of additional bonus points per category. We'll be going over those. Allows the main questions to have reasonable guidelines, like I mentioned, but still have some extra room for those who might be making their scratch from scratch. And it allows a score to be bolstered with one area shining to help compensate for another. Okay, this is the entry that we're going to be sample judging. Full disclosure on this entry, this was my very first calligraphy and illumination work. My laurel was at least partially for calligraphy and illumination, so I know that this has a lot of room to grow. I'm going to be saying all sorts of things, so if you feel I'm being harsh, it's on myself. I also picked this item because it's an item that both has some promise, but also lots of room to grow, so we can see what constructive feedback might look like. Here's some basic information about the entry. It is an illumination of Psalm 96, verses 11 through 13 in Hebrew. And the materials there: watercolor, cartridge calligraphy pen, fish glue, gold leaf, and parchment paper. That was all I wrote in my documentation, but I assure you this is what they print out certificates at school for. Like, congratulations, you got, you know, best dressed for the year 2019. That's the level of paper being used here. And it's based on the 1407 French Book of Hours for the layout, the year 1230 Bestiary for the animals pictured, and then a Haggadah, which is a Jewish book about Passover from the 14th century, for the illuminated initial word and the Hebrew script. The picture on the right-hand side, it's framed, and it's got a border with leaves, and a deer and a lion, medieval lion, so it looks like a dog, in the bottom, and then in a gold and leaf and illuminated with red and blue leaves border, some Hebrew. The initial word is large and it's got a lot of white work in it and some gold leafed dots in it. And then a picture of a sea cow, I don't know, whatever they thought that was in the Middle Ages. So there's several elements to this. But wait, what if I don't know much about illumination or calligraphy? How can I judge this entry? This is a key question asked by judges throughout the ages, and I will tell you, not every judge is an expert or maybe even well-versed in the area of the entries that they're judging. Much of the information can be gotten from the documentation or other judges, but one of the things that we've tried to do is put together a source for some basic information about different categories. So for instance, the website for it is http artswiki, artswiki.artemisia.sca.org. And there's a lot of information. So I'm just going to pull it up real quick here. So here's the home page, and you can see a lot of category-specific pages here. Another view is to go to our grand categories. So if your item, for instance, is in illumination, I can go down to manuscript arts, illumination, and I can see here's a link for illumination. There's another one for calligraphy. So I'll just click on that. And here is a page that talks about what I might look for with regards to authenticity, difficulty, and workmanship for manuscript arts illumination. There is another one for calligraphy, cartography, leatherworking, all sorts of things. If, by the way, you ever feel the need to give some updates or feedback on this, we also accept that. I'm going to be sharing a lot of this information just in the slideshow, but if you want to follow along, feel free to go and read that page. Pause this and go read that page about illumination, and probably the one about calligraphy as well, because this does display both of those. Let's get into the questions. I'll warn you, there are 24 questions. It shouldn't take you that long to go through a normal entry, but of course I'm talking through here with you and trying to explain the questions and what you're looking for. So I would expect this to take longer than a normal judging entry. So the first question, we're just going to dive right in there. We're in the authenticity section. Rate the overall authenticity of the end product. This is how well the product looks and feels like a period item. So overall, to what degree can the entry be mistaken for a period work? Is the piece period with no blatant mundanity? Do style element substitutions have a creative reason, such as personalization for a gift? I'll get back to that. Does the product correspond to known examples showing period aesthetics, motifs, and designs? Not talking about materials, tools, or methods, just the overall look and feel for the item. There'll be more specific questions in a little bit. So we mentioned creativity here. What we mean by that is if the period example shows a bear and you put in a griffin because you're trying to be Artemisian, even if your griffin is, you don't have any examples of a griffin from that book or from that time period or whatever, that makes total sense. What if it was a platypus? Now, we don't have any of those in period, but that's an interesting example. Is that deeply meaningful to whoever might be getting an award scroll? Then that seems like something you can, put in here, especially if you can do it in a similar look and feel. So creativity here in the look and feel says, if it's not directly period, does the substitution you made have a reason? Yes, this is a deeply meaningful thing to the person who's going to be getting this. And does it fit in with the rest of the work? So now let's look, let's see here. Let's see how we did on this. So what I did was I went through here and just kind of put little like suns for things I'd give full thumbs up on, and clouds for things that were like, yeah, sort of. It's sort of mistaken for a period work. It's not quite up to snuff. But honestly, overall, the piece is period. It's based on period items that went together in a fairly period way. The substitutions have creative reason, the way that the Hebrew elements went in with what were French or English other elements. They had a reason for it. And the product corresponds to known examples. In fact, if you look at the documentation that I will bring up here very briefly, and we'll go into more later, you can see that examples were given of the layout, of the animals, of the Hebrew. So it corresponds to sort of, to these known examples. Going back to where we were here. So how did we do on this one? So we've got a rubric on the right. This is from 1 to 4 points. 1 to 2, limited look and feel. 3 to 4, could be mistaken for a period item with creative personalization, not detracting from the period look and feel. Overall, I'd say a 2 to 3 seems reasonable. I would probably give this item a 3. As someone who has stared at this item for way too long, I feel like it's a little bit chunky. It doesn't quite achieve the look and feel. I wouldn't give it a 4, but it does okay. So I would probably give this item a 3. Question number 2. Now we're talking just about materials. So we're breaking it down and being very specific. So one thing can't blow your entire score. So for the materials, does the entrant go to reasonable effort to use period appropriate materials? If period appropriate materials were not available or prohibitive due to cost or safety, can never mark down because of safety, are reasonable substitutions made? Do any substitutions detract from the overall appearance and feel of the piece, or do they enhance it? So we've got a sort of, does the entrance go to reasonable effort to use period appropriate materials? The watercolor is not the worst. The gilding is actually pretty cool. The paper is the worst, literally the worst. And if period appropriate materials were not available, were reasonable substitutions made? Once again, there were more reasonable substitutions. Typically in calligraphy and illumination, or in illumination, we prefer gouache, which is less transparent paint. And under no circumstances would that paper that was used ever be the preferred material. I would just go with a watercolor paper, unless you wanted to go up to like a vegetable parchment or real vellum and so on. And do any subtractions detract from the overall appearance and feel of the piece? Yes, the paper very much detracts. So based on this, I would say, oh, and it's not the worst. Like I could have used markers, right? I could have used printer paper. The paper looks good. It just feels horrible and has a lot of buckle to it. So I would probably give this a 2 out of 4. The materials were not period materials and weren't great substitutions. There's a lot of room to grow on this. You haven't seen it yet, but the documentation actually says under lessons learned to use better paper next time. So in comments, I would probably agree with that. Question 3, rate the overall authenticity of the tools and methods used for the project. So how do we do? Does the entrant go to reasonable effort to use period appropriate tools and methods? Somewhat. The gouache painting, the tools and methods there, paintbrush seems reasonable. The calligraphy used a cartridge pen, so sort of. But the gilding, on the other hand, is actual gilding using fish glue, and a method with that. So we're not talking about the materials, but the techniques half and half. If period appropriate tools and methods were not available or prohibitive due to cost, safety, etc., are reasonable substitutions made? A cartridge pen instead of a dip quill, for instance. I'd probably have preferred a dip pen be used. Do any of the substitutions detract from the overall appearance and feel of the piece? They don't really detract a lot. Overall, it's fair. Anywhere in the 2 to 3 range. To me, and you're usually going to end up with judges agreeing on a range. And if there's multiple judges and I were to pick 3 and you were to pick 2, that's fair. What we want to avoid is where there's such a disagreement that I'm a 4 and you're a 1. We should probably look at what's going on there. So 2 to 3 is reasonable. I'd probably give this one a 2. The gilding effort gets definitely a thumbs up, and probably suggesting using gouache for that, although that's really more in the materials. Okay, internal consistency. We'll talk about this one for a moment. Rate the internal consistency of a project. What this means is, are elements of the piece internally consistent, combining elements, styles, materials, tools, and techniques that are all the same general time and culture or reasonable substitutions? So let's give some examples. So things that would be totally reasonable. Early 15th century French style manuscript, combining elements from late 14th English manuscripts or other similar sources. That's actually pretty consistent. France and England really were pretty close at that point in time. Late 14th, early 15th, that's pretty close in time. We're not looking for, were they in the same decade or the same year, or even that they had to be from the same manuscript, for instance. What we're trying to avoid is a 15th century French style manuscript with 10th century Norse elements. That would be a good example of lacking internal consistency. But keep in mind that a lot of time periods and cultures don't have as much of a wealth to pull from when it comes to examples. So we're still looking for look and feel here, but a Norse item may not be able to document their tools as well as a 15th century French item. So be a little bit understanding when it comes to especially earlier period tools and techniques. They may be documented to late period because that's what we can see. But does the look and feel work? In an example where you were trying to get Norse elements into a later period item, I would probably try to swap up some of the style elements to see if I could get it to match a little bit better, or accept that I will not be getting as many points in this category. This is worth 4 points, and I'll point out again the 3 sources for this was a 13th century French book of hours, 15th century French book of hours, a 13th century bestiary, and a 15th century Haggadah. My thought on this one is that the pieces are somewhat internally consistent. They're not off a ton, but between the difference of a couple of centuries and the difference of a very English style with this other Jewish style, I felt like it's not going to score top marks on this one. I would say somewhere, once again, this is a mid-range type item, somewhere in between a 2 and a 3. I would go with a 2 for this one. But if I were commenting on this and had the knowledge available, one of the things I would probably share is the Gaston Phoebus Book of the Hunt, which is a 15th century hunt book with animals. So another example for animals that would be more internally consistent. So I would probably go with a 2 for this. And now we get into the bonus categories. Does the authenticity of this project go above and beyond reasonable requirements? I made my scratch from scratch, right? What we recommend is any areas that excel, check on those, and then you can see the scoring based on how many you might have checked. Significant personalization for modern use or recipient, especially if the item was still done with period techniques and consistent styles. Yes, I really managed to work that platypus in there, and that's, I mean, it existed in period, but it certainly didn't exist in Europe in period. But I made it look, because it was very important to the person, but I made it look perfect. It looked just like if France had figured out what a platypus might have looked like. Significant attention to using period tools, materials, techniques, especially if they did extra work or steps to create or prepare for this. This is the I made my pigments type item. It's not required for the main questions, but you could certainly get a bonus for that. Significant attention to internal consistency, even as it applies to tools, materials, techniques. Really focusing on trying to keep all of the elements of this correct for your style. Maybe not using your wooden joinery techniques, or not using certain materials because it wouldn't have been available at that point in time, and really trying to focus in on what is appropriate for this time period. Is the entry indistinguishable from period example in every possible way? What you'll notice is that these questions tend to mirror the questions in the original question. So basically, did we go above and beyond in any one of these original areas? I typically wouldn't give bonuses unless somebody already maxed out the regular question. So let's see what my thoughts were on this one. I mean, technically, we could maybe talk about significant personalization for modern use. I very much wanted to incorporate this Hebrew element into the French and English, but honestly, like, it wasn't all that, and the overall look and feel, it wasn't completely consistent. So I probably would just go with a 0 for this one. Authenticity showed no above and beyond efforts. There's a 1 for if you exceeded, if you got 1 check mark, 1 bonus area, and then 2 for if you got more than 1 bonus area. Difficulty. Now we're in the difficulty section. So rate the difficulty attempted with respect to the number of steps or time requirements. Once again, we're looking at what was the attempt rather than how well we did. Like maybe it had a lot of steps, but I didn't really do them that well. We're focusing on the number of steps. Was significant time spent due to the project requiring numerous steps or many iterations of the same step? Or was extensive preparation required for one or more of the processes? So how do we do? There's actually a decent number of steps in here. There is the border, there's the illuminated word, there's the text, there's a number of different figures in there. There's some gilding. So there's actually a decent number of text. There's no specific extra preparation required. It's not at the top of the stack. Many scrolls have more text. The leaves along the edge could be denser. More details could be on the creature or more creatures. And those would all add steps time, but the gilding adds to it. This is a from 1 to 6 points. And this feels actually in a solid 3 to 4 range. Remember that we're not comparing this to the most extreme over-the-top example. Someone who's doing a full illuminated manuscript with dozens of pages, that is not a reasonable item here. That item, you just give it the top score and move on, right? So this is compared to a fairly typical award scroll, and there's certainly ones that have more to it. But there's actually a decent number of items here. I would probably give this particular scroll a 4. Just to go back to it real quick so we can have seen it again. This is where you can see that there's a leaf border. You've got the gold solid border with leaves worked into it, which is actually not as simple as I thought it was going to be at the time. Multiple animal figures. You've got this white worked illuminated word, and the fact that there's Hebrew in there, which is, in case you were not following along, not English. All of these things kind of help add up to the complexity, to the difficulty. Okay, so I mentioned probably a 4 on this one. The high end of medium. All right, the next question is about skills and techniques. Rate the difficulty attempted with respect to the skills and techniques. Now, just to be clear, this is the skills and techniques, the skills needed to complete the project, not the artisan's skills and techniques. The artisan may be skilled through the yin-yang, but this is a very simple project. So whether or not someone can carve this elaborate bone sculpture does not affect whether or not carving maybe a needle is a simpler element to that. So not that needles in themselves don't take some skill. So would the skill required to make the product take significant effort or practice to master? What we're really talking about here. Did it require multiple techniques to complete? Were a variety of skills and breadth of knowledge and competence required for this entry, basically? Were the composition and design elements difficult or intricate to employ, requiring skill and attention to detail? Did one or more techniques require experimentation or iteration to get correct? I've seen projects that were like, here was my first attempt, this didn't work, and then I did this other thing and now this worked. That shows that iteration. Let's see how we did. The skill required to make the product takes significant effort or practice to master. Given that this was my first ever item and I just tried it out, I would say not especially, although it could be argued that I didn't master them. But did the entry require multiple techniques to complete? It did, actually. There was painting, gilding, we mentioned this before, calligraphy, and so on. A variety of skills were required there. Were the composition and design elements difficult or intricate to employ, requiring skill and attention to detail? Yes, some, not especially. Did one or more of the techniques require experimentation to get correct? The gilding actually did. Based on this is a score out of 6 points, 1 to 6. I actually put this at a 5. It was probably a 4 to 5 range. There's enough going on here that this is actually reasonably difficult. Could argue whether or not, like I said, I did a good job at them. But we're not talking about the amount of time required, but just the number of skills or how hard those skills are. There's actually a decent number of skills here. The next question, for materials and tools. Rate the difficulty attempted with respect to the materials and tools. Was the work planned to be hand done or done using period tools and processes, especially if the modern tool or process was right there? My sewing machine is right here. Did I choose to hand sew it? As opposed to where a modern tool would be also difficult to get to. Were materials planned to be made or prepared versus purchased, or a lot of effort gone into getting period materials or close equivalents? This isn't a heavily weighted question. It's out of 2 points, so 1 or 2 points. Basically, did you put a lot of effort into using period tools and doing work by hand, or getting period materials and such, or didn't you? I can tell you that I did not. This entry, yes, it was hand done, hand painted and such, but the materials used showed absolutely no effort whatsoever. So between sort of like, done using period methods and techniques, sort of the cartridge pen, you know, but the lack of period materials, this one gets a 1. Rate the research required by the entrant to complete this item. Difficulty for an item may actually not be as well seen in the actual item itself, but in trying to research how this thing was made, as opposed to, I got this kit and I made the thing in the kit, really trying to understand how to create this thing is definitely worth some difficulty. This is also a low point question. It's 1 or 2 points. So basically it's a point on whether or not you came up with this from a period source and documentation, or used a modern inspiration. And for this item, this was definitely inspired by period sources. So this would be 2 points. And now we're at the difficulty bonus question. Does the difficulty of this project go above and beyond reasonable requirements? That's the key, is we're trying to come up with reasonable requirements so that the bar isn't at the moon, which is very discouraging for folks if the bar is at the moon. But if you went to the moon, we'd like to encourage that as well, because it is very cool. Here, have some bonus points. So areas are exceptional effort was put into handmade tools and materials. The item required exceptional experimental development on 1 or more processes. Exceptional depth of research was shown or required. Exceptional time investment or extreme number of steps. Yes, the lace was really cool, and then you made 8 yards of it. Exceptional variety or difficulty of skills required. There was some research. There was a few skills required. Nothing in here is requiring any bonus points. Our next section is on workmanship. We're going to look at the question, and then we're going to go actually look at the details of this particular entry. So, rate the degree to which the product meets its intended function. Now remember, workmanship is without any undue, without regard to how complex it was, and without a lot of focus on whether or not things were authentic. So we already judged those things. Just how well did it turn out? Does the item do what it should do? Does it look, sound, and feel the way it should? Does it appear capable of withstanding normal historical use? We'll talk about that. Did the materials and techniques utilized contribute to a recognized and usable product? We're not talking about fine tuning. We're not talking about the tiny finishing details. If you meant to make a quiver, did you manage to make a quiver? Can it do what a quiver needs to do? Let's look at our entry. This is, I've got a top and a bottom view. This is the top, where you can see here the illuminated, instead of an illuminated capital, in Hebrew manuscripts, it ends up being a first word, so the illuminated first word. The border here, it's cut off a little bit at the edges, but there's a full border of leaves. There's a, I don't know, dragon, a sea cow, some Hebrew text. Look at the next one. And at the base, more Hebrew text, more of the leaves, and this deer, elk, and a lion that definitely looks like a monk who had heard about a lion from someone who'd heard about a lion. So let's get back to this. How well did this product meet its intended function? This is out of 6 points. Well, it intended to be an illuminated psalm in Hebrew. Does it do what it should do? It absolutely does. 100%. Does it look, sound, and feel the way it should? I gave it a sort of on this one. You can't feel it in your hands through this video, but the nature of the paper makes it very buckly. It doesn't actually feel very good. And also, based on that, it doesn't, it's so thin, it doesn't appear capable of withstanding normal historical use, in which, unless that use is putting the frame on a wall and never touching it again. And did the materials and techniques utilized contribute to a recognizable and usable product? I know I sound down on this paper and such. It's not that it was inauthentic. In this case, it was just not the appropriate use. So, like, it definitely comes out with what it's supposed to do, but there's a couple detractors. So this is out of 6 points. And I'd say a 4 to 5 range. Actually, it does pretty good. The nitpicking doesn't need to come in until later. I'd probably give this one, give it a 5. This is an illuminated psalm. Let's really quickly, here, we'll look at it again. This has a general look and feel. There's a lot of finishing things. That's a different question. But we have an illuminated psalm. Okay. So I'd probably give this one a 5. But let's talk a little bit on how this might apply to some other things. So for costuming, for instance, this would maybe apply to fit. It would apply a little bit to seams, but not how well the seams are finished necessarily, but how well the seams look like they're going to hold up. Was the stitching really loose? Will it hold up? Is it the sort of thing that looks like you were sewn into it and then you'll never be able to wear it again, for instance? Not that that's ever happened to me. Food. Now there's a really interesting question. How can food be capable of withstanding normal historical use? For that one, we recommend, will you still be alive after eating it? Just saying. So normal historical use may be short-lived. We wouldn't expect bread to last for a long period of time, but it should do its job for as long as it's supposed to. So, you know, if it was supposed to feed you for a day, would it feed you for a day? So all sorts of objects, there's ways to apply this one. So let's look at our next one. So next question is, rate the degree to which the product is properly finished. Now we're looking down at the details. You might want to get a magnifier. I'm super nearsighted. I might take my glasses off for some of this. This is the first time that you definitely, in judging, really need to be able to see the details on a project. To get down and dirty, maybe flip it over and see what's underneath, and so on. Is the product finished properly, or does it have obvious flaws? Does the product appear neat and correct upon close inspection? Are there obvious unintentional mistakes? Occasionally people will put in intentional mistakes. Is the product balanced and consistent? So now we're getting down to it. For this particular item, let's go back to it. Here are some of the things that I can see with this. The straight lines along our border aren't. They're not straight and they're very smudgy. I didn't have a steady hand at this point in time, so it's very wandering. The leaves aren't super consistent. The spacing on the lettering is actually really wide. Hadn't figured out kerning yet, apparently. Those were elements that I might notice here. Let's see what else we've got. Let's see here. But on the other hand, the leaves and animals and letters are all well formed with appropriate shading. It does have consistent outlining, even if it gets a little bit blobby, like the things that were done consistently. This would be actually a fairly mid-range. It is not great, but given what it is, I'd probably go with a 3 to 4. I could see someone going a little bit lower, even a little bit higher, depending on what flaws you want to point out here. This is another spot where the wiki site might well have some additional thoughts on things you want to look for, especially in the workmanship. What is a good illumination? What is good bread? What is a good costuming item? What is good woodworking? What would I expect? Because I, as not a woodworker, have no idea what finishing looks like. So this is where we might go to the wiki or go into the documentation or ask another judge. So the product's balanced and consistent, and there's no really obvious mistakes. It's just not well finished. The finishing touches are a little squiffy. And upon close inspection, you can see a lot of those little elements that aren't great. So on this one, like I said, I'd probably give it actually a 4. It's not looking bad. There's a lot of room to improve. It's a simple item, but generally speaking, it's done fairly well. It's done middling, on the high end of middling well. How about that? Okay. Rate the degree to which the project demonstrates competence with the chosen techniques, processes, materials, and tools. So I have chosen to use gilding with fish glue. How well did I do with that, right? I have chosen to use certain materials. How well did I do with that? So this is where the entry definitely struggles. There's a lot of stuff that was chosen that just doesn't come through. Not just because the materials weren't period, but because they just were inappropriate. And I didn't treat that well. So for instance, I used paint that was way too wet with paper that was way too thin. And the end effect wasn't great. The calligraphy could have used a wider nib. Is another good example where I chose to do calligraphy but did not quite use the tools correctly. But the gilded dots don't look bad. They look pretty good, and the overall effect is not bad. I would probably go with a 2 here. So this is out of 4 points, 1 to 4 points, probably a 2. So this is a good example of a middle of the road item. Some items, just to regroup on the being kind, if you're ever wondering if you should go between a 1 and a 2 on an item, it helps to think how somebody will feel about a 1. Some items are truly 1. It's truly as simple as it gets. It truly was the worst application of anything possible, or it really, you couldn't see the psalm here. But think real hard about a 1. You'll note that we took away a 0 entirely, because truly, I have created a thing. Here's the thing, you have the thing. How could I have done a 0 on the thing for you have it here? A lot of the changes that we've made here have been actually a mental boost to trying to let our artisans look at their feedback and look at their scores and internalize them without undue negative feelings about that. So I'd probably go with a 2 on this one. Workmanship bonus questions. Areas include, resulted in just an excellent product and form and function. It really is going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to work for a long time. The work was executed with extreme care and precision. All the finishing bits are amazing. And it has an extremely good period look and feel as well. So those are some areas there. Okay, so for the display, of course, for this video, you haven't seen a display. So we're going to make some assumptions. We're going to assume that the item, as you saw, was framed. It's on a stand on the table, so it's kind of tilted upward. It's got 3 copies of the documentation next to it, and a set of watercolors that were used and a brush also displayed with it. So we've got that. Visualize this display here for a moment. This question should be easy. Number 15, rate how well the display provides necessary labeling and documentation. This should be a gimme. Are there at least 3 copies of the documentation present? If a judge has another copy, obviously that counts. You shouldn't have to fight over just 1 copy of the documentation. For a food or beverage display or any product that would be used on the skin or the body, are all the ingredients clearly listed? There is a solid chance for an allergic reaction here. If I'm going to ingest this, are all the ingredients listed? This is a safety concern. Safety is very important. Are any other safety concerns labeled? I've seen examples of this being someone ground their own pigment and used some items that were questionable, and so then they did, they said warning and what items were there. They also, by the way, put those items up out of easy reach for short people, the extreme short young type people. So this is 1 point. You either did it or didn't. So these are the sort of display items we're looking at. They're low point, but what we want to encourage is people to actually do this. For my mental visualization of our display, all of these were covered, and we got the 1 point. Yes, we got that. Now, rate how well the display allows the observer to view the entry. Does the entry stand out? Is it easy to see it and its details? Some examples of this: a dress on a dress form, or draped nicely on the table instead of maybe folded up or the horrible wadded up and thrown onto the table. Calligraphy and illumination entry might be propped up to make it easily viewable, and so you wouldn't have to dig under the documentation for it. Just something set up so that it's easy to see. This is the entry here. Not everything needs an elaborate display. We don't need a pedestal, a 3-tiered whatever. This is 1 point for basically, was this display easy to visually access? Some things don't need anything extra, and that's fine. You don't have to have a full dress form. That's unreasonable. Many people can't afford a full dress form, in which case, for a costuming entry, they should do their best to lay it out nicely. In my display, my imaginary display, the item was up on a stand, so yes, for sure, that's 1 point. Now we get a little bit more. Rate how well the display helps to enhance the understanding of an object. An object could very easily exist in a vacuum, but they didn't exist in a vacuum in the Middle Ages. An object was created from materials, it was created by tools, it was created for a purpose. And this is one of the things we'd really like to convey in our competition, is what went around this device. So this could include examples of tools, materials, intermediate steps. Like here is an example of some other portion, maybe some other step that could be seen. Could be photos. It could include some visuals to show an entry in use, or otherwise put into historical perspective. It does not require an elaborate fair sort of display, right? The 3-paneled, with infographics all over. Although for the record, that would typically do it as well. For our imaginary display, the addition of the theoretical paint and brush helps a little bit. but it doesn't give a lot. Other materials and tools might be good. For this particular item, I'd actually recommend including the Haggadah, the Jewish book that was used, because it's a style that isn't often seen. So it might be interesting to have that available. But we don't need just elaborate books. This isn't in place of your documentation. This is to put it into context. So some ideas in general, having the item in use. I made a pin. The pin is on a hat. Materials used. Here's some raw materials that would have gone into it. Tools. Other examples of the item. Item is part of a larger ensemble. I made this hood. I did not make this hood. I made this hood, and now maybe I would put it on, if it was on a dress form, maybe I'd put it onto an outfit that the hood would go with. What's not required, like I said, is that fair-like display. So my display got a somewhat. It could use a little bit more to put it into context. Note, I should have mentioned this before. In the incredibly theoretical event of a virtual, non-face-to-face competition, this particular item can be satisfied in pictures, in showing, in submitting pictures of the item, of materials, of that sort of thing. The previous item, which was the labeling and safety, should be considered a 1, full points, unless, let's see here, let me go back real quick. So the necessary labeling and documentation should be a 1, unless there were safety concerns about the entry that weren't communicated when it was dropped off. And how well the display allows the observer to easily view the entry. Were the pictures in focus? Was the video in focus if there was a video? Pictures do not need to be of every seam and every buttonhole of the item, but generally speaking, were they viewable? And then the display helping to enhance the understanding. Like I said, pictures can convey some of that. All right, bonus question. Does the display of the project go above and beyond reasonable requirements? The display helps communicate details from various steps in the process, or it's interactive maybe and helps to work to educate the observer. The display goes above and beyond in allowing the observer to view or interact with the entry. This is areas where maybe the full dress form or the fair-like entry display might go well with some bonus items. All right, we're getting there. Documentation. I just want to point out that most artisans are really nervous about documentation. There are the rare exceptions to that, but I, as an artist, made this thing. I spent hours or days or weeks knitting this item or painting this item and now I have to write a paper about it. It's not everybody's strong suit. So it's important though, because it shows that our work is rooted in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It's grounded in period practices based on period sources. Without that information, it's just a fair entry, right? I definitely made this thing, I won a blue ribbon or whatever. We want to make sure that we're, what about the Middle Ages, right? That we're fulfilling that element of the SCA here. So, but in respect to people's nervousness here, I'll be very clear, we're not looking for a research paper. We're not looking for a dissertation. We want a reasonable expectation. We have broken this down to some specific questions that we're looking for, and also decrease the overall points for documentation so that things like authenticity or workmanship are worth more than documentation. All right, So this particular question, and then I'll show you the documentation for this device, for this entry briefly. So this one is the 6 W's. How well the documentation includes the following: who, what, where, when, why, and how. There are 8 questions here, 8 check boxes. What is it? What was the item like in period? What is it that we're making, and like examples or discussion. Where was the country or region of origin? I'll talk more about this one in a moment, but we don't, like, is there an example of country and region of origin? Many things will have multiple regions, right? A span of area, but do we have an example where it is, for instance, France or Germany or whatever? What was the time period it was made or used? This doesn't have to be a specific day of the week. We're talking about a year or a century or a range. This was made between the 6th and 8th century. You can see this, but my example is from the 8th century. Who used it in period? Now, this is an interesting question that not a lot of people often think of, but once again, our objects don't appear in a vacuum. Who would have used a psalm in period? Well, this would have been used by religious people trying to, read off prayers and whatnot. So who would have used this particular item? Who would have used this dress? This dress was for a noblewoman or a peasant. This cake would have been eaten, once again, by the upper class. Why was it used in period? Why? So just a short example, because once again, it's important, this object that we've created outside of just the creation of it. We want to understand just a little bit, but we're not looking for a research paper or dissertation. Just why was it used in period? This cake was eaten during Lent. This dress was worn during winter to stay warm, or worn as a bottom layer. This particular entry was, why was it created? It would have been created to help probably the wealthy or such to have books to pray from. How was it made in period? We're looking at for materials, tools, techniques, what methods were used to create it. And how did the entrant make it, right? Once again, materials, tools, techniques. Let's see how well I did on my very first entry. This is, like I said, this is a good one because it's middle of the road. There's lots of room to improve. So it's a 3-page documentation. This is the first 2 pages. I'm not going to make you read this whole thing. I'll highlight what we've got. What is it? Cool. It's an illumination of Psalm 96 in Hebrew. Country of origin, time of origin. As a judge and as an entrant, I actually like now to pull this out and put it wide up at the top. So it would say illumination of Psalm 96, etc. And then right under that say 15th century France. But the overall layout did come from that time period, so it could be argued that that information's in there. What was it like in period? Pictures worth so many more than 1,000 words. And this has several pictures in it. So for illumination, this can be fairly simple. Here are some examples. But otherwise, it may be scraps of fabric. It may be descriptions of what it was like. So give some examples of what are we looking at. Otherwise, when I look at something, I may not know whether this has a period look and feel or not. Let's see here. Oh, why did the artist create it, right? So for outcome of both study, looking at illumination and Jewish studies, that's why this was created. Here's the 3rd page. Has some materials, so this is one of the elements of how was this created. What's missing? A lot of things are missing, actually. In this particular case, who used it in period and why? How was it made in period? There is no discussion in here whatsoever about period materials, tools, or techniques. Now, if you don't know about illumination, this is a great example where you might want to go to the wiki and look for some examples of how was that made in period, so that you can best judge the authenticity. How did the entrant make it? I did talk about materials, but not about tools or techniques. So there's no discussion of my process. I did this and this and this and this. Just a list of materials. One other thing I want to point out is that typically speaking, you will be reading the documentation first. You will not read the documentation after judging the other items. But this worked out fairly well for the class. So typically speaking, you would start an entry by reading the documentation, and it'll give you a feel for what they did and maybe why. But you're not going to judge it until you get to the documentation area. If they didn't put something in that was authentic, we also have, like I said, the wiki items. Don't let the documentation really overly sway your authenticity, difficulty, and workmanship. It should give you information to be able to judge that, but if they didn't do a good job in their documentation, try to judge the period, the piece on its own merits. Let's see how well we did. So, the documentation did show what is it, what was the item like in period. It had those pictures. It showed what was the country and region of origin and the time period it was made. It showed why did the entrant create the item, and had a little bit of how did the entrant make it. But we're missing out on a few items. So kind of got like 4.5 out of 8 check boxes here. So how did we do? So this is out of 4 points. A 1 in this case is up to half of the questions were answered. Meaning if we got less than half of the questions answered, it's a 1. Some of these questions are pretty simple to answer. And then a 4 is like most all of the questions were answered. In this case, I'd actually probably give it a 2. There's some pretty important stuff missing. The how is pretty important. I could see maybe a 3 if I was trying to be generous. Maybe it was a baronial or shire level competition. But this documentation, I spent most of 3 pages really talking about what I learned about the Hebrew, then the creation process. So this is a good example of where there's some solid room to grow in the documentation. Okay, rate the extent that the documentation included the steps of the techniques. Are the steps of the techniques being used clearly explained? Are drawings, photos, pictures, diagrams, recipes included where appropriate? Are explanations given for why any substitutions or compromises were made in the materials or techniques? This is a really simple question. It's either a yes, no, or somewhat. So no is 0, yes is 2, somewhat is 1. I included some drawings, some pictures that were the basis of the design, but really didn't go to any of that other stuff. So I give this a 1 for a somewhat. Rate the sources used in the documentation. Does the information presented trace back to reliable sources? Primary and secondary sources are preferred. Museum collection items, research books, rather than, for instance, Pinterest and Wikipedia, which have their place, but it'd be better if we could find a medieval equivalent. Some things can really only be found officially on, for instance, Pinterest. There are tiny little museums in Hungary that just don't have their stuff online, but someone's taken a picture and put it up there. Be reasonable if that's the case, but things that are pretty obvious and mainstream, we're looking for the museum site rather than a Pinterest picture of the item. Do the sources used relate to and support the entry? Don't just let somebody put in some sources and be like, those are museum sources, but they're just random books that have nothing to do with anything, right? Is the information appropriately cited? Can you tell where information came from? So if I were to say, in period, they used vellum, you know, can I give an example of vellum, for instance? Or this picture came from France, can I point to where I can show that the picture came from France? Is there a bibliography of some sort? We're actually going to go backwards and take a quick look at this documentation. So we can see that there's some amount of information here, but this is not well cited. I actually didn't do a lot of citing here. I showed where the information, like that this was a 14th century Haggadah, but not what book it came from, right? So that's an example of where citing is needed. But on the other hand, the references, the bibliography, it's there, it's got the information, and the information is relevant. It's got the various different manuscript items that it came from. So a couple other items here. Go. Things to keep in mind, that we are not in any way, shape, or form dictating how they cite things, right? It could be inline, just a little parentheses. It could be footnotes. It could be like written in, like, we know this because of this book, blah, blah, blah. We just want to know that the information came from somewhere other than thin air, right? Again, the bibliography. We are not saying it needs to be a particular format. This is not a research paper. All we need to know is there enough information in the bibliography to find the book or the museum item, etc. So there's no enforced format for that. Simply, is it there? Very important. If you ever do a research paper, there's more stringent guidelines in that. But here, we just want to know, do you know the information? No one should ever get points taken off because they did MLA and they were supposed to do something else, or vice versa. So rate the sources used in the documentation. Let's see what we did. The information presented does trace back to reliable sources. Do the sources used relate to and support the entry? They do. There's no citation whatsoever. There is a bibliography. I would do a 1 for sure. There's definitely enough information to rate a 1, but could use some citations in there. This does not have to be every little thing. This is not a research paper. If I cite the main and support the main items in my element, materials used in hats, hat making processes, and so on and so forth. But for instance, didn't cite my, information on, I didn't show a source that the color brown is period. I would not recommend taking off points for that, unless it was a dye bath to dye something brown. So try to keep in mind whether or not something is really core to your item. Okay, is it organized and legible? Rate the extent that the documentation was organized and legible. Does it include useful lists of tools and materials, intermediate steps perhaps? Does it include visuals, if possible, showing the entry in use, or maybe otherwise putting it into historical perspective? Is the documentation generally relevant to the entry? I have judged a 20-page documentation of which one paragraph was relevant. I would not have made that on there. Somewhat. This documentation needs some work. It has some lists, and it's generally relevant, but doesn't help us put it in perspective, and it's really missing some information. So that's a somewhat. Bonus. Does the documentation of this project go above and beyond any reasonable requirements? I'll read these. I think it's safe to say that mine does not in this case. Has extra effort been put into detailed steps, techniques, pictures? Is the documentation like it's a how-to guide? I could really take this home and do it. Not a requirement. It is not required that you be able to teach someone from your documentation. But if you can, cool, have a point, right? Does it show significant research, right? We can really see the depth of research here. Does the documentation give insight to the item with extra details on period, practice, or use? And is the documentation of publishable quality? Should we send this up to the TI to get that? Would this be a good article? Would this be really fascinating to read? Now, before we go on into further sections, there was a question about whether or not lowering our requirements would keep people from doing really excellent documentation. And I will say, if there's documentation that's truly excellent level, consider making it a research paper, right? If that's your thing, that you really enjoy this documentation, there's a whole category for that with its very own judging form that we're not going into today, but is very specific to the research paper quality there. So yeah, this particular item did not get any bonuses in documentation. The last of the number of questions, which is overall impression for the entry. This is 6 points, and this is literally anything that you want to say about it. Did you like it? Did you not particularly care for it? I would really hope that you don't scrawl, "I hate this" on the corner. Myself, I'd probably give this a 5. I think that it does a nice enough job. I've had it on my wall for over a decade, but there's a couple things I'm kind of ashamed of about it. But for your point, you know, what do you think? You really liked the layout, and the animals really spoke to you. The colors just didn't work for you, or like, you know, changing the language around just wasn't your thing. At one point in time, I judged 2 different perfumes, and one of them got a higher score than the other because it turns out I liked the smell better, right? The whole thing was really good, but this one just smelled better than the other one. So did you like the entry? Is the overall appearance, design, color, material combination really pleasing or suitable? Is it a unique or outstanding display or presentation? Is it a really logical, creative endeavor with period methodology, with creative substitutions? Would you like this piece for your birthday? Are the design or stylistic elements well conceived? It's just really wow. Did any of the judging areas just blow you away? Is it completely authentic from the ground up? Anything you want here, it's 6 points, go for it. Okay, feedback comments. The last section is for feedback, and this is extremely important. Put in comments. Artists often, I didn't finish this comment, artists often actually feel really cheated if they don't get any comments. And please make them a bit more than "this is great." Let me give some examples. 2 key elements to include here. 1, elements that you felt were well done, that you would like to see more of. Instead of "this was really great," I really loved this outfit, and you know, we could stand to see so much more of it, or your stitching was super even, or whatever, like things you'd like to see more of. Or we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Top suggestions that would help the entrant's next entry or future efforts score even better. What does that mean? Constructive feedback. Let's talk about it. If you said, and this is not, by the way, an area to justify your score like this is, "I took points off because the paper was modern." Is that true? It totally is. But if I say that, what does the artist hear? You did it wrong. Your entry's bad. Your baby is ugly. Now, is that what you meant? No, you're just trying to justify your score. Well, don't. Instead, phrase it like this. "Next time, I look forward to seeing how your entry does with a stronger paper, like Bristol board or even a period vellum. Next time, it would be really cool to see this suggestion, because I think it will help your next effort," right? Next time, instead of "this time was bad," I'm stabbing you with a knife. Stab. When you're reading this, you're just, "Oh God, it was bad. It was so bad." Not every artisan, but enough that this is a terrifying process for them, and this is how we help make it better. Don't justify your score. What can they do next time better? Here's another example. The source you used had some inaccurate information. The artist is like, "I'm not a scholar. How the hell am I supposed to know about that, right?" Instead, "I've also really enjoyed this other source." Give the source a name, you know, and it's got some other information that I think might be helpful, specifically about your stitches or whatever. Next time, this might be helpful, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about this. Positive feedback. What did you like about it, right? I really liked the illuminated word. The first word, it looked really subtle and pretty. Or I like that you tried gilding. Not even I liked the gilding. Maybe the gilding wasn't that great, guys. I like that you tried it, right? I liked the colors you picked here. I liked your stitches. They were very neat, right? Look, there's stuff. It could be big things and it could be little things. Don't just say, this was great. And maybe you don't have any constructive feedback. Maybe all your feedback is positive. But don't just say, this was great. Say, I really liked your, out of things here, I really liked the detail on the face. I really liked the something specific that you thought was good. I thought this was so well made, it's going to last forever. Even if it was a minor element, feel free to talk about it. If it was an introductory effort, say it was a great start, right? And that you'd like to see more. So, like I said, maybe it wasn't the best attempt at gilding, but you liked that it was tried. There's a term called a bad news sandwich that we're going to talk about to help have the artisan be receptive to our feedback. If you have constructive feedback, try to sandwich it in with positive feedback. This is very important because our brains will start to reject things when they feel too confrontational, feel like they're attacking. And now I won't hear the words that you're trying to tell me. You're trying to help me. But all I can hear is, oh God, they hated it. I can't even just. So I really liked the thing. Next time, consider doing blah, blah, blah. So for this particular element, what are some comments that I would love to go back and give my past self, right? Once again, what are the top items to improve? This item was my first calligraphy and illumination effort. And once again, this was an area I got my laurel in. So I have lots I could say, so many things. But if I give an overwhelming number of feedback suggestions, even if they're all phrased super well, it comes over as an attack. And honestly, I can't take in that many. So give me like the top two to four feedback elements. So, and then mix in the positive feedback. So how do we start? Wrong way. This item was a really fun topic. I loved how the mix that you put everything into. Next time, and I know you said this in your documentation, really consider doing a stiffer paper like a watercolor paper, or maybe even a vegetable parchment. Like, don't shoot for the moon. I wouldn't recommend this person waste money on vellum just yet, right? Like, they're not there yet. But what's the next step? It had a great look and feel, extremely interesting. I noticed that you didn't document your process a lot. The steps that you took to create this, that'll be really important going forward. So make sure and note that down in your documentation next time. The initial word had some really fun white work in it. Use fun here a lot, apparently. Some fun white work in it that I hadn't seen before. I think it would look even better next time if you used gouache, which is more opaque than the watercolors that you used. It would give a more period look and feel. This was good. Next time, consider doing that. This is the very best thing you can do for giving constructive feedback in a way that the artist will be most predisposed to take. I could say more. Hey, you should use a thicker nib for those size letters. The nib size was too small. Next time, consider a dip pen. Your Hebrew hand doesn't quite match the example. You need straighter lines on your thing. Now it's like, yeah, this was like, next time do this, and it's all really good. But it's like, didn't they like anything about it? You know, or like, wow, I have so much room to improve, I might as well not even bother. What's the lowest hanging fruit? Give that feedback. Okay, so that wraps up this particular judging form. Don't worry, there's not 2 more sections. I just want to mention that we have 2 additional judging forms in the Artemisia nude forms. One of them is for a performance. A performance is any live performance or demonstration, something you cannot hold in your hands, something that when it is done, it is gone, has a different sheet. It's actually pretty similar to the object sheet, but a lot of the object terms, the questions don't directly apply. So they've been tweaked to help put you in frame of mind to judge the performance. It can be very frustrating when you're trying to judge something and the judging sheet doesn't make sense based on the item. Speaking of which, research papers. There is a separate form for research paper, meaning any nonfiction writing that is not based on a period practice. A riddle or a period how-to book would be wouldn't fall into that category. It would be an object. But a modern research paper, article, a modern nonfiction writing falls under this category. There is nothing in this object judging form that is relevant for a research paper. But research papers are very cool and they're very appropriate to our competitions, so they have a separate form. To finish up, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, watching this video. Thanks for hopefully helping us out on an upcoming competition. And thank you so much for the work that you'll be doing to encourage our artisans, encourage them to continue to create, to learn, hopefully to continue to enter for judging or competition. If you're still not sure about whether or not you're ready to judge, please go to a competition and ask the coordinator to pair you with an experienced judge. We are always happy to have somebody walk through you on an actual item. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, or I think that this is a 3. What do you think? And get a better feel for it on your own. Folks are happy to help out, and if we train you to be a judge in future efforts, many hands make light work, and that's really what the SCA is all about here. That is everything I had. I will put on here real quick my email address. I forgot to put that on there. If you ever have any questions about this, you can email the Kingdom Minister of Arts and Sciences at, hold on, type, arts.artemisia.sca.org. Let me just put this up here. Also, more information can be found at our website, which is arts.artemisia.sca.org. Has all of our current forms, links to the wiki, and I will be having a link to this video as well. Thank you so much and have an amazing day.